The advertisement had been folded so many times the creases had gone soft as cloth, and she read it once more in the gray light of the station before she let herself believe she was actually going. Widow or spinster, sober and willing, wanted for a working homestead near Pelican Crossing in the district of Assiniboia, room and board provided. Particulars settled on arrival. She had carried it in the lining of her glove for 11 days, and by the time the train left Brandon behind, and the country opened flat and endless to the north and west, the paper had worn thin enough that she could see the gray of her own palm through it. She had not always been the kind of woman who answered advertisements. She thought about that as the prairie went by, mile after mile of it, the snow not yet down, but the grass already gone the color of a lion's hide and lying over in the wind. A year ago she had a husband and a quarter section of black soil near Portage, and a kitchen with a window that faced the morning. The fever had taken him in the space of 9 days in the spring, quick and stupid, the way a thing can be both, and the loan against the land had come due in the autumn, with nobody left to argue it down. She had paid what the team and the wagon brought and signed the rest away in a land office that smelled of pipe smoke and old ledgers, and walked out into a street she no longer had any business standing in. She was 31. She did not feel young, and she did not feel finished, and she had learned in that office that there was no third thing the world had a name for. The conductor called the crossing twice before she understood it was hers. She gathered her trunk and the small basket that held her needles and thread and the few things that were still only hers, and stepped down onto a platform that was 3 planks wide and ended in mud. The town, if it was a town, was a single street that gave up after 100 yards. A general store with a false front and a Hudson's Bay sign gone pale in the sun. A livery, a church not yet finished, the rafters open to the sky like the ribs of something. A few houses set back behind picket fences that nobody had got around to whitewashing. She counted the people she could see and got to 9. They counted her too. She was used to that now, the looking. She set the trunk down beside her and waited, and let them look, and looked back without hurry at the country that began at the edge of the last building and did not stop again until it reached whatever came after. She knew him before he spoke, because he came toward her the way a man comes toward a thing he has decided to be civil about whether or not he wants it. He was perhaps 40, broad through the shoulders, and gone a little stooped in a way that had nothing to do with age, and he held his hat in his hand when he reached her, which she noted and filed away. His boots had been good once. His coat had been turned at the cuffs by somebody who knew how, and she filed that away too, because it told her there had been a woman, and that the woman was not here. He said the name she had signed, and she said yes. He said it was a fair piece out, and the light went early this time of year. And she said she was ready when he was. He looked at the trunk and then at her, and seemed to be revising something in his head. Whatever he had been told to expect, she thought. It had not been a woman who looked back at him steady and said nothing extra. He carried the trunk to the wagon himself and did not ask her to help, and did not make a show of not asking. The team was a pair of grade horses, sound but soft in the feet, and the wagon needed grease in the offside wheel. She heard it complaining the whole long road out and knew the sound the way she knew her own pulse. She did not mention it. She watched the country instead. There was good water in the low places, sloughs ringed with rushes gone gold, and the soil where the road cut through it was black and deep, deeper than anything she had farmed near Portage. And that was the thing that made her sit up a little on the hard seat. Land like this did not stay poor unless a person made it poor. She filed that away as well, against everything else she was learning, and she said none of it aloud. He talked some, in the careful way of a man who has been alone long enough that his own voice surprises him. He said the place was 160 acres proved up, and another quarter he was paying on. He said he ran a few head of cattle and put in wheat and oats, and that the last 2 seasons had been hard. He did not say why the cuffs of his coat had been turned by a woman who was gone, and she did not ask, because there are questions a person earns the right to, and she had not earned that one yet. The homestead came up out of the prairie the way they all did, suddenly, after you had given up watching for it. House of squared logs, chinked with clay, low and long. A barn that leaned a degree off. True, a hen house with a sagging roofline and a door hung wrong so that it dragged. A garden plot, or what had been one, the fence posts still standing but canted, the soil inside cracked into plates the color of ash. She took it all in from the wagon seat before he had even drawn up the team. The way she would take in a length of cloth before she cut it, looking for the flaws and the grain together. The henhouse roof had 2 seasons left in it, no more. The barn leaned because the sill on the north side had rotted, not because the frame was bad. The garden had been good ground once and could be again. The well, when she found it with her eye, was sweet water close to the house, which was the one thing nobody could have arranged and the one thing that mattered most. He helped her down and she stood in the yard, and the hens came round her feet, a dozen of them, hungry and bold and pecking at the hem of her skirt, and she understood without being told that this was the work she had been sent for. He wanted a woman to tend the chickens. She looked at the hens, which were a poor mixed lot, light layers gone half wild, and then she looked at the garden and the barn and the deep black soil that ran off in every direction farther than a person could walk in a day. And she thought that a man who could look at all of this and see only the chickens was a man who had stopped seeing. The house was small. He said so as he carried in her trunk, said it the way you confess a thing, and she said it would do. There was one main room with the stove and the table and a bench, and a smaller room off the back where she would sleep, and a loft where he slept. And the whole of it was clean in the way a man keeps a thing clean, which is to say not dirty, but not lived in either. A cup sat on the corner of the counter nearest the window. She would learn. It was always there in the morning. His coffee, the same cup, the same corner, set down by habit in a spot that made no practical sense until you understood it had been somebody's spot once, and he had kept it out of a loyalty he could not have explained. There was a Bible on the shelf and a ledger above the woodbox, and a woman's shawl hung on a peg by the door that he had never taken down. She saw all of it. She put nothing of it into words. That first night she made supper from what was in the larder, which was less than she had hoped and more than she had feared. Salt pork going soft flour with weevils in the top third of the sack, a few withered potatoes, eggs. She sifted the flour twice and made biscuits and fried the pork and the potatoes and scrambled the eggs soft. And she set his plate at the end of the table nearest the window where the cup sat, because that was clearly where a person ate in this house, and she stood at the stove and ate from the pan. He noticed, he looked at the place she had not set for herself, and started to say something, and then did not. They ate in a silence that was not yet comfortable but was not hostile. And the wind came up after dark and found every gap in the chinking, and she lay in the narrow back room and listened to it and did the arithmetic of the place in her head until she slept. She woke before him and had the fire going and the coffee made and his cup set in its corner before he came down the ladder. He stopped on the bottom rung when he saw it. He did not say good morning. He drank the coffee standing and looked out the window at the gray yard and the hens already moving. And she watched him from the stove and learned the shape of his mornings, the way she would learn everything about him, by watching and saying nothing. She gave herself the first week to learn the place before she changed a single thing in it, because she had been a guest in another woman's house before and knew what it cost to be the one who moved the spoons. She fed the hens and gathered the eggs and counted them, 11 the first day, 9 the second, and went looking for the difference and found it. A gap in the henhouse wall where a board had sprung, and the sign of a weasel, and 2 birds gone broody and hidden in the rushes by the slough. She mended the board with a scrap from the woodpile, and a hammer she found hanging where it should not have been, and she carried the broody hens back and made them a quiet corner, and the count came up to 14 by the end of the week. And he noticed that too, though all he said was that the eggs had been thin lately and now they weren't. It was the barn she watched longest. He kept 11 head, mostly young stock, a milk cow gone dry, 2 oxen he used for breaking, and a saddle horse that was the only animal on the place in real flesh. The cattle were thin coming into winter, and that was the thing that frightened her more than anything she had seen. Because thin cattle in October on the prairie were dead cattle in February. And she had buried a husband and a farm both, and she was not going to stand by and watch a man bury his cattle for want of asking the right question. So she asked it. She asked on the 4th evening, plain over supper, how he was fixed for hay. He set down his fork. She watched the question land, and she watched him decide whether to be insulted by it. And she watched him decide not to be, which told her more about him than anything he had yet said. He said the slough hay had come light. He said he'd cut what he could from the low quarter, but it was short, and he knew it was short. He said it the way a man says a thing he has been lying awake over. She asked how many tons. He told her. She did the figure in her head against 11 head and a long winter, and it came up wanting by a third, and she said so, and she watched him not argue, which was the moment, she would think later, that anything between them became possible at all. A man who could hear a hard number from a woman he'd known 4 days and not need to fight it was a rarer thing than good land. She said the low quarter wasn't the only hay on the place. She had seen, coming in, a wide slough on the section line where the grass stood belly-high and uncut. And she asked whose it was, and he said it was the half-section to the north. That belonged to nobody just now, the man who'd filed on it having starved out and gone back east 2 springs ago. She said then it was free for the cutting, and he looked at her and something moved behind his face, and the next morning he greased the mower himself, and they went north together. She driving the team while he ran the sickle bar, and they cut hay on dead land for 3 days under a sky that could not decide whether it was autumn or winter, and they hauled it back load by load and stacked it against the barn until the stack threw a shadow you could shelter a calf in. It was not all the hay they needed, but it was the difference between short and enough, and they both knew it, and they did not speak of it because there was nothing to say that the work had not already said. There was a neighbor, the only one within a morning's ride, a wide German woman named Mrs. Dewhurst, who ran the next homestead with a husband, Dewhurst, who was good with iron and not much else, and she came round the second week with a crock of butter and a look she did not trouble to hide. She studied the cut hay and the mended hen house and the woman standing in the yard who was not the woman she remembered, and she said, in English she had learned at a hard angle, that the place was looking better than it had in a long time. She said it, the way people say a thing when they are also saying something else, and the something else was a question, and the woman did not answer it, because it was not yet a question she had answered for herself. Mrs. Dewhurst left the butter and rode off, and the woman kept the butter and kept her own counsel, which was the only currency she had carried west that was still worth anything. First snow came the last week of October, dry and small and serious, and the prairie went white from one horizon to the other in a single night. She had known cold all her life, but not this cold, not cold with nothing in front of it for 1,000 miles. And she learned that winter the way you learn a hard language, by getting it wrong and surviving the getting it wrong. She learned to bank the hen house with straw and snow, both so the birds kept laying through the worst of it. She learned to break the ice on the trough twice a day and to carry warm water to the cattle in the killing cold so they would drink enough to keep their weight. She learned which boards of the house leaked the heat, and she chinked them with rags and clay, working on her knees in the cold by lamplight. And the house got warmer, and he noticed and said nothing and brought in more wood than he used to, stacking it without being asked in a way that was its own kind of speech. There came a stretch in January, 3 weeks in, when the cold sat down on the country and would not get up. The thermometer Dewhurst had nailed to the porch post stopped meaning anything below where the red went. A blizzard came up out of the northwest one afternoon while he was out at the far stack, and the world went white and roaring in the space of an hour. And she stood at the window and could not see the barn 40 feet off, and she did the only thing there was to do, which was to take the rope he kept coiled by the door for exactly this and tie one end to the porch post and pay it out into the white until she found the barn wall by walking into it. He was there. He had got the cattle in and was working by feel to fork them hay, and she found him and they finished it together. 2 shapes in a roaring white nothing. And when the worst of the wind dropped enough that they could cross back to the house on the rope she had run, neither of them said anything about it. She made coffee. He sat at the table with his hands around the cup until they came back to him. And he looked at her across the small room, and she looked at the lamp instead of at him, because there are things a person is not ready to be seen wanting. And she was not ready, and she knew he was not either. They lost 1 calf that winter. Just the one. She had thought, lying awake in November doing the arithmetic, that they would lose 4. They lost 1, and they lost it to a thing nobody could have stopped. And when he came in and told her, flat, the way he told her everything, she heard underneath the flatness the size of what 1 was instead of 4. And she said only that the others looked to be coming through. And he said yes, they did. And that was the whole of the conversation. And it was enough. She had been keeping the ledger. She had found it that first week above the woodbox and noted where it was and left it alone. And somewhere around Christmas he had set it on the table in front of her one evening without a word, which was a thing she understood. She went through it by lamplight over a week of evenings while he mended harness across the table. And what she found was a man who was not poor so much as he was alone, which on the prairie came to nearly the same thing. He owed the store at the crossing, and he owed the bank in Brandon on the second quarter, and against it he had the cattle and the proved-up land and 2 years of hard luck. And what he did not have was a second pair of hands or a second head to think with. And she saw, going through the careful crabbed figures, exactly where the place had begun to slide, which was the spring his wife died, which was written nowhere in the book and was plain on every page. She did not tell him she had worked it out. She closed the ledger and set it back on its shelf, and the next morning she started in on the things the figures had shown her. She salted the eggs down and traded the surplus at the store for seed she would want in the spring, choosing it herself, arguing the price down with the storekeeper, a narrow, watchful man named Otto Kroll, who had clearly never been argued down by a woman and did not enjoy the experience and respected her for it after. She figured the cattle could carry through if they sold the 2 oxen in the spring, when oxen brought money from the new settlers breaking land, and bought back a younger team in the fall when prices fell. And she laid this out for him one evening, plainly, the whole turn of it, and he listened the way he listened to everything, and at the end he said it was a good plan, and she understood that this, from him, was a kind of astonishment. Spring came the way it comes on the prairie, all at once and muddy and disbelieving. The sloughs broke up and ran. The geese came over in lines that took an hour to pass. The black soil came out from under the snow soaked and steaming and ready. And she stood at the edge of the old garden plot one warm afternoon with her hands on her hips and looked at it for a long time. Then she went and got the spade. She gave the garden a month of her life that spring, in the hours stolen around everything else. She forked it over a square at a time, breaking the plates of old soil, picking the roots and the stones, working in the henhouse muck she had been saving all winter for exactly this. She straightened the canted posts and restrung the fence against the rabbits. She started her seed in the window of the back room weeks before the ground was ready, little flats of it on the sill, catching the long evening light, and when the danger of frost was as past as it ever got, she set the plants out in rows so straight a person could have sighted a rifle down them, because crooked rows were a thing she could not abide and never had been able to. He watched her do it. He did not offer to help, and she did not ask, because it was hers, the way the cattle and the wheat were his, and there was a line between them they were both learning to keep and to honor. But he fixed the garden gate one evening without being asked, planing the drag out of it so it swung clean, and she came out the next morning and found it swinging clean, and stood there a moment with the watering can in her hand, and did not go and thank him, because it was not the kind of thing you thanked a person for. It was the kind of thing you noticed and kept. The wheat went in late, but it went in clean. The 2 of them and the team working the long days from gray to gray, him at the cedar and her bringing the meals out to the field, and then taking a turn herself when his arms gave out, which they did, because he was not as young as he worked. They got the crop in, they got the oats in. The garden came up the way she had planned it, straight and unhurried, peas and beans and the cabbages and the long rows of root crops that would feed them through whatever the next winter was. And she stood in it, one June evening, with the light going gold and the swallows working the air over the slough, and felt something she did not try to put a name to, because she had learned that some things were spoiled by naming. There was a bad week in July. Hail came up out of the southwest one afternoon, the green-black sky every prairie farmer learns to read like scripture. And they ran for the stock and got the horses in and stood in the barn door together, watching it come. and it laid down a swath 2 miles wide that took the Dewhursts' wheat to the ground and missed their own by less than a quarter-mile. They stood and watched it miss them. When it had passed and the sun came out hard and steaming on the wet ground, he let out a breath she had not known he was holding, and without thinking about it, without deciding to, he put his hand on her shoulder, just for a moment, the way you touch a thing to be sure it is still there. She did not move away. She did not move toward him either. She stood and let his hand be on her shoulder and watched the hail melt off the Dewhursts' ruined field, and then he took the hand back, and they went and saw to the stock, and neither of them said a word, but something had been said, and they both knew it, and the not saying of it after was a thing they did together now, on purpose, like the work. She helped Mrs. Dewhurst put up what could be salvaged from the hailed field, the two women working 3 days side by side in the steaming heat, and Mrs. Dewhurst, who said most of what she thought, said while they worked that the man had been a ghost for 2 years and was not a ghost now, and that everybody at the crossing knew it, and that some of them said it was the chickens, and some said it was the hay and she herself. Mrs. Dewhurst said it was neither. The woman said nothing and went on tying the bundles, and Mrs. Dewhurst looked at her and laughed, her wide German laugh, and let it be, because she was a woman who knew when a thing was nobody's business and was going to turn out right regardless. The crop came off in August heavy and clean. They cut it together, she driving the binder team while he stood behind, the two of them moving down the long gold rows in the heat, with the dust on them and the chaff in their clothes. And when the threshing crew came round in September with its great steaming machine and its gang of hard-eating men, she fed the whole crew out of her garden and her hens and the new butter from the cow that had freshened in the spring. And the men ate and went on to the next place, saying it was the best table on the line. And she heard that get back to her through Mrs. Dewhurst and kept it, the way she kept everything, quietly, where it did her good and showed nobody. The wheat made more than the figure in the ledger had needed it to make. He paid the store and he paid the bank in Brandon, and he came home from the crossing in October, a year nearly to the day since he had met her train, with the receipts folded in his coat, and a look on his face she had not seen on it before, which was the look of a man who has remembered, after a long time of forgetting, that the future is a thing that can be looked forward to. He laid the receipts on the table where she could see them. He did not say anything about them. She looked at the figures and understood the whole of what they meant, which was that the place was no longer sliding, that it had turned, that it was for the first time in years a thing that was being built up instead of run down. And she understood, too, that he was showing her the receipts, the way another man might have said a great many words. And she let the showing be enough, because it was, and because words had never been the currency between them, and it was too late and too good to start. The storewoman, the storekeeper's wife, said to her in November on the road that she had heard from more than one person that the Eastern homestead, theirs, was the best-kept piece of ground in the district now. She said it with the same edge Mrs. Dewhurst used, the edge that was also a question, and the woman thanked her and kept walking, the cold coming down off the same mountains the train had carried her away from 1,000 miles ago. And she found that she did not mind the question anymore, because she had finally answered it, somewhere in the long turning of that year, without ever once saying it out loud. He had said, that first day, that he wanted a woman to tend the chickens. She thought about that sometimes, banking the hen house against the second winter, which she did now without thinking, the way you breathe. She had tended the chickens. She had also brought the cattle through, and got the hay off the dead land, and salted the eggs, and straightened the rows, and read the ledger he could not bear to read himself, and found in it the place where his grief had started costing him money. And she had set every one of those things right, with her 2 hands and her own clear head. And the chickens were the least of it, and they both knew that now. He had wanted so small a thing. She had given him the whole of what she was, because that turned out to be the only way she knew how to give anything, and he had taken it the way you take a thing you have stopped being afraid of losing, which is different from the way you take a thing you are sure of, and is better. The second winter, when it came, did not frighten her. She knew this cold now. She knew where the house leaked, and she had chinked it in the autumn before it could. She knew the hen house and the trough and the rope by the door, and she knew the man across the table, his silences and the order of his mornings, and the cup he set in its corner, which was his cup now and not a ghost's, because she had watched the day, somewhere in the spring, when he took the dead woman's shawl down off the peg by the door and folded it and put it away in the trunk where such things belong, gently, without ceremony, when he thought she was not looking. She had been looking. She had looked away. Some things you witness by not witnessing them, and that was one. He made coffee in the morning the way he always did and set her cup beside his. Now, the same corner, the two of them together. And she found it there when she came down and drank it, standing at the window with the light coming up over the east, where the wheat had been and would be again, and the chickens already moving in the yard, their quick small heads, their reliable industry. He came in from the barn one of those mornings with his jacket still on and the cold coming off him, and stopped in the doorway and looked at her at the window. He did not say good morning. He had never once said good morning, and she had stopped wanting him to, because the not saying was its own thing now, theirs, and meant more than the words would have. He looked at her the long, plain way he had, and she looked back, and outside the prairie went on forever the way it did, white and patient and enough. And the lamp burned low and steady on the table, and they had stopped, the two of them, needing to explain themselves to each other, which is the whole of what she had crossed 1,000 miles of frozen country, hoping she might someday find, though she had not had the words for it then, and did not need them now.